my topic for tonight, which is at least partly devoted to the connection between Tiferet, which I call metaphysical beauty, and Hod, which is more the what we call the instantiation of beauty. Instantiation is a very fancy philosophic term where we take something like a general metaphysical idea, such as love, justice, truth, or beauty, and then when there's an instance of it, you might say some metaphysical truth is instanced in the world. We call that an instantiation, something rooted into the world. So there's the beauty, all kinds of beauty, including the metaphysical beauty of music. And we won't try to define here what aesthetics is. It's a worthwhile area to study, by the way, what actually makes something beautiful. When we study the Kabbalah, of course, we are studying a series of metaphysical ideas. These emanations are, however they came about, they come to be a kind of Jewish Neoplatonism. In fact, the Kabbalah is described by Gershom Scholem, the great founding scholar of Kabbalistic studies, as an intersection of Jewish Neoplatonism and Jewish Gnosticism. The Neoplatonism is that in some way the infinite mind of God is then manifested as several different metaphysical archetypes, the 10 sfirot. The 7 sfirot are the ones that have spiritual psychological usage, and the idea is that they actually exist in some metaphysical way. So for example, when we do acts of justice here, we try to have it correspond to some metaphysical ideal of justice, which is one reason we know when justice isn't done. You might say that conscience is connected to the metaphysical idea of justice, and we try as much as we can to make human justice correspond closer to the metaphysical ideal of justice. By the way, this is called natural law theory. There is an idea of justice by the nature of things, not the law of nature, but by the nature of things. There is something called justice. In human nature, there's something called justice. We try to bring that into being. Well, in the same way, when people say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, of course, that's a metaphor. By the way, in the early modern period, people actually used to think there's something in the eye that saw beauty. People did experiments on the eye to find out what it was, to no avail, of course. It is not in the eye of the beholder. What that means is beauty is subjective. Well, that's partly true. You might say the appreciation of justice is subjective, but that doesn't mean that every subjective thought about justice meets the ideal of justice. It's a very complex idea, is the interplay between what you might call the metaphysical reality and the subjective experience. Many people defer only to the subjective experience, and therefore they say that all metaphysical ideas are purely and only subjective, which is, of course, a deep and disturbing fallacy that no one actually believes in. No one actually believes that justice is purely subjective. Otherwise, people would not get upset when justice does not happen. So those who say that justice is merely subjective, some kind of social construction, find something they care about and they will rail against the injustice of things. By railing against the injustice of things, meaning an injustice done in society, clearly then justice is not just a social construction of what society believes. If that were the case, there would be no injustice in society. Our sense of justice actually critiques society. So our sense of justice is both formed by societal norms and values. That's true. But societal forms and norms and values do not define our sense of justice. Otherwise, we would not get offended when justice is not carried out. So anybody who critiques justice in society is automatically saying that justice is not merely a social construct, but rather they're connected to some criterion by which we examine justice. Again, that's typically called natural law theory. So as you look at these 7 lower sfirot that we are talking about, imagine that there is some metaphysical standard, something beyond our physical life, which is the standard, the criterion by which we try to operate. We're down in our, as it were, lower level of being, and our work is to try to bring our ways of thinking, feeling, speaking, acting more in accord with a metaphysical value. Again, for historical reasons, I don't want to get into tonight. The the sfirot, the emanations of the Kabbalah took shape. The seven lower sfirot, as you'll look at the map that I provided some time ago, and there are many, many maps online. The seven lower sfirot go by the following names in Hebrew: Chesed, which connotes love and caring; Gevurah, sometimes called Din, which connotes law, justice, morality, norms, boundary setting. The third sphira is sometimes called Tiferet, which is metaphysical beauty, sometimes called Emet, the metaphysical dimension of Emet. I like both, so I call the third sphira Tiferet Emet. By the way, this is a triad. So in the deeper study of Kabbalah, we actually study two triads, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, called Chagat, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet. But that doesn't work for me because remember, I see the second of the lower seven, Gevurah, as also called Din, and I also call the third sphira of the triad not just Tiferet but also Emet. So I prefer to say Chesed, Gevurah, Din, Tiferet, Emet. Love, care, logic, morality, boundary setting, and then the third one, truth and beauty. We are now into the weeks of the second triad, which is Netzach, Hod, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, or Nahi, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. I talked about Netzach last week. Netzach for me has a sense of the will. Linatzeach means to overcome an opponent. A menatzeach in Hebrew is a conductor of a symphony. You might say the conductor imposing the will on the symphony to take cacophony and turn it actually into music. Netzach also connotes the idea of Moses, of prophecy. So you might say that Netzach is Chesed, Gevurah, Din, Tiferet, Emet, and now into the voice of the prophet. So that upper triad, Chesed, Gevurah, Din, Tiferet, Emet, or love and caring, logic, boundary setting, and truth and beauty, now go into the mouth of the prophet. So what does the prophet prophesy? Typically about love and caring, about justice, about reasoning well, and about truth and beauty. It becomes the prophetic statement. So you might say that all those upper three now will themselves into the mind and voice of the prophet to be announced into the world. So think of Netzach as, from my perspective at least, as an act of will in the prophetic voice. And that would mean for each of us. What does it mean for the prophetic voice to be in each of us? Well, by the way, this is a very big topic in the Kabbalah. Can individual human beings achieve prophecy? Well, the Kabbalah said yes. With enough training, you can train your mind to channel the divine mind and therefore speak words of love, justice, truth, and beauty. When you do that, you actually can feel the divine channeling through you. In fact, I would go so far as to say that all great music is prophecy. Now, that sounds kind of strange because when we think of prophecy, we typically think of the words of the prophet. However, from a Kabbalistic perspective, prophecy would be any, as it were, true words of love, caring, justice, reasoning, beauty, and truth spoken into the world. So all music, all good to great music is prophecy. All good to great literature, including poetry, is an act of prophecy. How do we know that? You read a poem and you are brought into the inner depths of the poem, and that something true and beautiful is articulated. That's one reason poetry, for example, one of our favorite endeavors here on Friday nights to read poetry. We are brought into the prophetic message of the poet. It sounds grandiloquent when I say that, but I mean it very deeply, that something in the poem speaks to some deeper level of meaning where we can comprehend a truth, not a truth spoken in some kind of rational way, but you might say to an inner truth of life. In fact, that's one of my favorite definitions of truth, not a statement that accords with reality, but rather some kind of, again, statement, music, poetry that leads us to comprehend, oftentimes in a nonverbal way, to some truth of life. That's why it affects us so deeply. Sometimes I read a poem and something in me feels I've just encountered a deep life truth. Put more religiously, I've just encountered some aspect of the divine being spoken in this poem. So, therefore, poem, music, and so forth, well, all art is an act of prophecy, meaning if one way that we understand aesthetics is the force of love, justice, truth, beauty, the force put into a form. This is one way to understand the Kabbalah: force and form put into the form of beauty, which takes us into the Sphira for tonight. If Tiferet, the third Sphira, again, this beautiful, interesting coincidence of opposites of truth and beauty, you might say is potential beauty, metaphysical beauty, then Hod is actually the instantiation of beauty. So what do we mean by that? The force of beauty achieves a form. The force of beauty achieves a form. So all beauty, you might say, has these two elements. It's the force of metaphysical beauty that's landed into a form. So when you think of all the things that you consider to be beautiful, I mean, we especially like photography, we like poetry, we like cinema. Try to imagine that beauty has been compressed into a form, which is why all beauty, you might say, when it is formed, formalized, there's a tension in there, as if the metaphysical power only exists within that frame in an uneasy way, as if beauty tries to burst out of the form imposed upon it. So when I studied aesthetics, one thing that we did study, and again, I won't go on to a lecture on aesthetics tonight, every creation of aesthetic value has a tension within it, the tension of the components and the tension, as it were, as it wants to break out of the form imposed upon it. So on Sunday night, if I'm not mistaken, we go through the week of Netzach, which is will and prophecy and Moses. And we go into the week of Hod, which is starting Sunday night. Hod, which is, you might say, the instantiation of beauty, and Hod as Aaron, and Hod as the temple. And you can see the connection immediately. If Moses is the word of prophecy, the unstable word of prophecy, we never know where that word of prophecy is going to go. It can rile things up. It can overturn a regime. It can bring justice to the world, where the temple, you might say, is trying to hold beauty in a particular place and time. Aaron is the priest, Moshe is the prophet, Netzach is will, Hod is, you might say, the instantiation of beauty. Again, however these Kabbalistic emanations came into being, I just think it's a wonderful act of truly some degree of coincidental genius. As I wrote in my Shabbat email, the 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, the 7 lower emanations, I call this the marriage of the sevens, where somebody, after the Kabbalah came into being, probably sometime in the 12th century, said, wait a minute, there are 7 weeks, there are 7 lower sphirot, let's use each of the lower sphirot as the theme for a week. Now, of course, we have to remember that the names, and therefore the themes of the 7 lower sphirot are not stable. For example, in some Kabbalistic systems, the first Sphira is not Chesed. You'll find some more rare versions where the first Sphira is Gedulah. You'll find that universally, the Sphira that we're working on, Hod, in the Chabad tradition, is called Hodaya, which is thanksgiving. Now, I know that Hod actually refers to the temple, but they want it to be a meditation on gratitude. It does not work for me, because I like to see Netzach as will and Moses and prophecy, and Hod as Aaron and the temple and beauty. But Chabad has its way of doing it. I'm sure it works for Chabad people. I've tried it. It doesn't work for me. So I'm back to what I would call a more traditional mainstream understanding of this week, which is Hod as splendor and beauty. I wanted to introduce a dimension this week that is part of my counting of the Omer, the marriage of the sevens, the 7 weeks, and the 7 sphirot, for an overt spiritual psychological practice, and that is the struggle between what we'll call the true self and the false self. That is one of the most standard themes in spiritual psychology. So I'll expand on it a little bit. referring to some of the spiritual psychology that I teach in Wisdom Works, which, for example, is managing ego states. So let me give you unfortunately, a not too rare example. Sometime when I'm counseling a person or a couple, there's the problem of the person who's violating the first basics of Wisdom Works is no speaking in anger as much as possible, and as much as possible, no criticizing, complaining, condemning, engaging in escalating conflict. Criticizing means pointing out the flaws of another person in an unkind way, and therefore can entail some forms of unsolicited advice. Some advice is beautifully and artfully put. You ask permission. You understand the inner life of the other person. So a word of advice is perfectly placed. It's a word of gold in a setting of silver, as the proverbs say. However, some people use advice, supposedly unconsciously, to point out to the object of the advice that they don't know what they're doing. They need to be schooled on the facts of life. They're lost, and the speaker of the advice is well suited to educate them. So I've seen some people give advice, and it comes out as kind of cruel, kind of a person establishing domination and letting a person that they don't know what they're doing. And I've worked with so many people, especially young men with overbearing fathers, but not always, that the advice of the father comes out as really demeaning and hurtful. And that's when I began to include unsolicited advice under criticism. By complaining, you remember, I mean insincere why questions. When we say to a person, why did you do that? What's the reason you're doing that? Why are you standing there? Why didn't you do that? It's not really a sincere question for information. It's a complaint clothed as a question, which why it confuses people. I've often said when a parent says, why didn't you do your homework? The kid starts to think up why, tries to answer, and the parent says, I don't care why, just do your homework. And the kid is thinking, Mom, Dad, why don't you just talk straight? Just if you don't like it, didn't do my homework, just say you didn't like it. Why confuse me with a why question? Well, passive aggressive language, insincere why questions, there's a whole host of verbal transactions that are not overt criticism, but they function as a complaint about the other person. So in general, reduce complaining as much as possible if one wants to be a virtuous person. Condemning, any over-the-top language, accusing, blaming, labeling, cutting down, putting down, etc. I put this under the C of condemning. I just like the 4 C's. That's why I put it under condemning. And then escalating conflict. Now, why all of this? Sometimes when I ask a person who criticizes another, who gives unsolicited advice, who complains, who uses condemnatory language, I say, can you explain the reason why you're doing it? Now, I know what's coming, but I want to get it on the record anyway. They say, well, this other person's making a mistake. This other person needs to be straightened out. This person is not on the program. It often comes down as they're transgressing the order, the orderly life that the criticizer has imposed. People who engage in what I call unnecessary anger or unnecessary 4 C's, they typically are people interested in order. I see this as an inauthentic extension of ego that other people need to live in the ordered life of the person who's trying to control them. So oftentimes the 4 C's are examples of a person trying to pose order on other people, and therefore the transgressions are not moral transgressions, they're transgressions of a perceived sense of order. So again, with the more mature, developed person, yeah, they may say to themselves, yes, I have a need for order, but not to the degree that I will impose order through the 4 C's. If I have a sense of order and I think someone is out of order, I'll talk to them. I'll reason with them. Maybe my sense of order is unreasonable. Maybe it's inauthentic. Maybe they have a point of view that I need to learn. That's a higher order of thinking. That's a mature, well-developed person. People operating at a low level assume that their sense of order is a right sense of order, and therefore their engaging in the 4 C's is warranted and legitimate. Okay, so I'm not saying that's good, but it's better than the next thing I'm going to say. is when I ask a person engaging in the four C's and I quiz them. Is it because you have a sense of order that you want in the world? Yes. You believe that the other person is out of order, somehow violating your sense of order? Yes. And you believe that your sense of order is correct. They say, yes, all that. Thank you, Rabbi. You really get it. Then I say, why so harsh? Why so harsh? And they say, well, they don't listen if I don't do it harsh. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Since the other person isn't listening, the person then increases the degree of harshness. Now, speaking harshly typically causes pain, emotional pain in another person, and causing unnecessary pain, unnecessary harm is the definition of immorality. If morality has to do with minimally not causing harm in another, not causing unnecessary, negligent harm in another, then causing emotional harm, again, it's not the severest kind of immorality, but it is not moral to cause harm in another person. So I've counseled so many people on this, and I've said, have you thought about a way of trying to persuade another person to live in your sense of order without ramping up the degree of language to the point that it becomes hurtful? People think for a moment and say, almost verbatim, I shouldn't have to think that hard. They're too sensitive. Meaning, my increasing the force of harshness is because they are out of order. And if they can't take my harshness, it means they are too sensitive. You've probably, nearly every human being that I know has gone through that conversation. One person says, that hurt. The other person says, you're too sensitive. Now, I intervene on the side of morality that I don't think there are excuses to cause unnecessary, negligent hurt to another. That's a moral foundation of mine. So when a person says they're too sensitive, my response is, what if they're just sensitive enough? I mean, what if in the whole spectrum of people being sensitive, they might be on the sensitive part of the spectrum, but they're not too sensitive, they're just sensitive. So if you have a sensitive husband, wife, child, parent, friend, let's say they fall in the realm of sensitive, that doesn't license you to say harsh things to them, because in their personality, it's hurtful. You don't get to say, well, in my personality, it's not hurtful. Oh, by the way, I should add here, try saying insensitive, harsh words to a criticizer. You will find immediately that these words are not acceptable, because many people who ignore the sensitivity of others are themselves profoundly sensitive if someone tries to criticize them. So you realize there is no reciprocity. There's actually no theory here. So what is it? What drives a person who may have, you might say, some sense of order, which is compelling and reasonable? Somebody's out of order, and they bring them into order with harshness. And now is the point that I want to get to. Oftentimes, with enough inquiry of an open person, I will ask, is there something in you that wants to be punitive? Are you trying to be punitive? Are you trying to punish them for not living in your sense of order? Are you saying, well, they've been out of order so many times, it's gone from reasoning to punishing? Many people resist that. They say, I'm not a punitive person. I'm not trying to punish. I'm just trying to persuade. And after enough discussion, a person says, you know, you're right. You're right. I've decided to punish them, to be punitive. Now look at this. This is a great example of the false self. You see, in the ego state of justice and order, which is a very common ego state, people want to bring justice and order to the world. They find someone in transgression or out of order. They feel a drive to bring that person into order. But as they bring the person into the order, they become punitive, which is a separate, rather surreptitious drive. Why surreptitious? Because most people actually don't admit it. They don't say to themselves, including being interested in order, I'm interested in being punitive. And there's an ego state within me that's on the lookout for opportunities to be punitive to other people. Again, typically within the immediacy of the family, parents, children, spouses, etc., sometimes close friends. And the more they look at themselves, again, this is a person who's willing to go on the journey. They look at themselves and they look at that ego state, that subpersonality, a hidden subpersonality typically, that has a drive to being punitive, punishing. They look at it and say, wow, that's really inside of me. But it hides under the cloak of justice and order. So here's one of my definitions of the false self: a drive to do something, an urge to do something under the flag of an acceptable ego state, but is actually operating as a destructive ego state. Now you look at what from my investigation, counseling, self-examination, every positive ego state can hide a negative ego state under its flag. I've talked many times about the example of love and caring. I remember one case in particular. It stood out to me because it was, such an atrocious inversion of language. I was counseling a couple, and relatively good guy up to a point. Had a very lovely and accommodating fiance, and one of his conditions for getting married and her moving into his nice commodious house was that his mother get to live there. And she said, you have enough money to get your mother an apartment, and I don't really get along with your mother. How, would you consider that she not live with us? And he said the following: if you really loved me, you would accept my mother. Love is unconditional, and you're putting a condition that my mother move out in order for us to live together. You don't really believe in love. You are actually putting your will on mine, and you're trying to have me get rid of my mother. And this woman was very, very unnerved by this. I mean, God forbid she would be an inauthentic, punitive person. So she came to me. She said, Rabbi Finley, is it true that by my wanting him to rent his mother an apartment nearby but not actually live with us, that I'm not a loving person? So I paused for a moment. I said, consider the following: what if you had said to him, if you really loved me, you would not throw in the condition that your mother has to live with us? That he does not believe in unconditional love because he's bringing a condition of his mother living with you as a condition of the marriage. So he was able to use the term love as a way to get his way, and not say, hey, we just have a conflict. I love you, you love me. I want my mother to live with us, and I don't think I can put my mother into an apartment nearby. And she could say, well, look, I love you, I love your mother to a point, but not to the degree that I want her to live with us, and negotiate. Instead of that, he snuck in, a what I'll call an ego state of control, meaning I will use the metaphysical value of love to guilt another person, to get them to comply with me. And I said to the woman that I was counseling, what if we just got rid of guilt? Get rid of guilt completely. All we have is the best replacement for guilt, which is rational obligation. Am I rationally obligated, if I want to marry this man, to live with his mother for the rest of his mother's life? Is that a rational obligation? I said it might be, but it's not a clear obligation at the outset. It's not an a priori obligation. It's an obligation that needs to be discussed. There are many marriages that don't have the primary obligation that a parent live with a couple, especially if somebody can afford a nearby apartment. So he filtered in an obligation because he knew, I think instinctively, that he could guilt his fiance into acquiescence. So I didn't have a stake in whether the mother should live with them or not. I just didn't want a person infiltrating so-called unconditional love, which, by the way, does not exist. There's no such thing as unconditional love. All love has conditions. If anybody ever mentions to you unconditional love, let your red flag go up, let your red flares go up. It does not exist. It's probably a manipulation or a person who's just speaking in naive, idealistic ways. All love has conditions. While you might fall in love, the emotion is involuntary. It arrives upon us, but the conditions of living out love are always negotiated for the reasonable satisfaction of both parties. Or as I sometimes say, that both parties are at least reasonably unhappy if they can't get to an ideal compromise. So here's an example where I realized he was using love as a way to manipulate. Again, I don't think consciously, I just think this is one way this guy got through life, was to guilt other people so that he could get his way. There's a form of reasoning called rationalizing. Rationality is open-ended. You use the tools of reasoning to arrive at an endpoint. To rationalize is to start at the endpoint and then think of the reasons to get there. So when some person says, well, they're rationalizing, but they're not using it right, what they actually mean is they're being rational. I make sure to correct people. This is called being rational, using reasoning, and rationalizing, which is supplying reasons for a conclusion that's already preset. Same thing with issues of truth. Some people are honestly on the open-ended search for truth, and some people start with a truth at the end and use the quest for truth as a you might say a surreptitious excuse to get there when they already know what the truth is. It doesn't take too long to smoke them out. I've discovered with a political situation today, it only takes 2 or 3 questions to smoke out a person's unreasonable truth, because they haven't arrived there through reason. They've started at the end, they've announced what the truth is, then they back reason their way into it, and the reasoning can't stand because they haven't reasoned to begin with. I think the same with statements of prophecy. A person says, well, this is true. There's no love, justice, truth, beauty behind it. It's just a proclamation that people say something is true, but they haven't really thought about it. So when you think of the different sfirot, now this is a way for you to go through the sfirot. When you go through the contemplation of chesed, love and caring, and you think about the love and caring that you bring to relationships, the way that you want to be cared for, the way that you want to care for others, is there the infiltration of the false self in there? Which means, has the false self found its way into your way of thinking, feeling, speaking, and acting? So in this way, you can look at the counting of the sfirot, not only as meditating on these wonderful medical virtues, meditating on these deeply. As I said in my Shabbat email, steep into them. Just don't count the Omer. Seep into every one of them. Let it seep into every crevice of your being, your thoughts, feelings, emotions, drives, impulses, the realm of the soul, and try to form yourself around them. If you do so courageously, you will discover the false self hovering in the hidden recesses of these different sfirot. So the counting of the Omer can be used as part of our search for cultivating the true self and for uncovering the way that the false self operates in life. And to add a theological dimension of this, it's a typical foundation of spiritual psychology. One reason we call it spiritual psychology, because it presumes the realm of spirit and soul. And one of the definitions of spirit and soul is where, number one, the spiritual self and the true self can dominate, can become present, and where we experience the divine. Spiritual psychology, almost by definition, means a psychology that premises the existence and the power of the divine in our paths of inner transformation. So therefore, one of the goals of spiritual psychology, including creating within ourselves virtuous people who can regulate our inner lives, all of that in the service of engaging in the spiritual psychological search as a way to make our lives vessels for the divine spirit. This is overtly a Kabbalistic idea. Why are we doing all this work? Because we want to make ourselves habitable for the divine, habitable for the soul. So try to imagine you're trying to create a temple, going back to the Sfirah for the coming week. You're trying to make your life a temple, a Beit HaMikdash for the divine spirit. It says in the book of Exodus, God says, Asuli Mishkan, make for me a Mishkan, a house of the holy, V'shachanti betocham, so that I may dwell among them. Well, the divine spirit, the Shekhinah, cannot dwell in a temple that is filled with the false self. I playfully brought up from 1 Samuel chapters 5 and 6 the golden hemorrhoids that were featured in the temple of the Philistines, if you want a great example of biblical humor, go to the book of Samuel, chapters 5 and 6, and you'll see a really funny kind of an Israelite animad version against the naive Philistines who built golden hemorrhoids in their temples as a way to ward off hemorrhoids. Anyway, that's for another time. Well, as I was writing my Shabbat thought, I thought to myself, yeah, there are temples that are so filled with the false self they become temples filled with golden hemorrhoids. I hope you don't mind the. It's a jarring image, but it's intensely jarring because your house of the holy may not be fit for the presence of the divine. So my goal tonight was number one to review the seven sefirot where we are now. Chesed, which is love and caring. Gevurah Din, which is strength, moral strength, boundary setting, logic, reasoning. Tiferet Emet, beauty in the sense of metaphysical beauty. Emet as in truth. And again, the search for truth, becoming a true person is essential to our work. The sense of Netzach, which for me is the will to bring those other values into the world. Netzach is also understood to be a sephira that includes Moses and prophecy. Sunday night, we're moving over to Hod, which is beauty, splendor, the instance of beauty, all forms of beauty, including poetry, music, etc. It's also understood to be the sphere of Aaron, the priest, and of the holy temple. These are wonderful metaphysical emanations to sink into, and they also function as ways if you have the courage and the will to smoke out how the false self can be operating surreptitiously and unseen under the flag of these wonderful sefirot that are, in my mind, guaranteed paths for human transformation. All right, that's my presentation for tonight.